Welcome, everyone, to this Munich Security Conference panel discussion on transatlantic priorities in uncertain times. My name is Leonard Schütte. I'm a senior researcher at the Munich Security Conference, and I'm excited to be moderating this particularly timely event. This discussion is part of Road to Election 2024, a digital event series initiated by the Aspen Institute in the lead up to the US election. Lenin once said that there are decades where nothing happens, and weeks where decades happen. And I think we might be having one of those weeks, because in the last 7 days or so alone, NATO celebrated its 75th anniversary and declared Ukraine's path to membership as irreversible. Donald Trump was almost assassinated, and J.D. Vance was picked as his potential vice president in a sign that the GOP may truly be entering a new ideological era. And let's see whether Joe Biden will still actually be the Democrats' presidential candidate by the end of this discussion. Now, these are momentous political developments, and they come on top of existing fundamental questions besetting the transatlantic relationship. And to make sense of all of these issues and tease out the implications, we have a stellar panel for you today. In alphabetical order, our first speaker is Elbridge Colby, who is principal and co-founder, of the Marathon Initiative and the former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. The second speaker is Wolfgang Ischinger, the president of the Foundation Council of the Munich Security Conference and, among others, a former German ambassador to the US. And the third speaker is Katarzyna Pisarska, who is chair of the Warsaw Security Forum and of the European Academy of Diplomacy. She's also a former Munich Young Leader. Welcome to all of you. Now, our intention is very much that this becomes an interactive session. So I invite all of you in the audience to post your question in the chat and specify whom you are addressing if there is a particular person. But to begin with, I have a couple of questions of my own. Rich, let me start with you. You are joining us live from the Republican National Convention. J.D. Vance spoke yesterday and Donald Trump is set to speak today. Can you share with us your impressions of the foreign policy discussions taking place and what they might reveal about the direction of travel of the Republican Party?
Sure. Well, thank you, Leonard, and great to be on with all these panelists and to be with all of you here from the Upper Midwest. Just be clear that I don't speak for President Trump or Senator Vance or their campaigns, but I can give you my impressions. And yesterday was actually the Foreign Policy Day, where the theme was a strong America and peace through strength. I'd commend to people's attention the platform released by the party. In past years, the platform has been a somewhat sort of arcane, not particularly relevant document, but I heard Congressman Waltz, who is the co-chairman of the platform committee, several times point out that President Trump had put a lot of work and edits into the platform, and it certainly reflects his kind of tone and rhetoric and thinking as far as I can ascertain. And I think the platform there, you basically have, I would say peace through strength, but peace through strength in the last kind of couple of decades has tended to emphasize heavily the strength element. And certainly that's an important part of it. But I think the peace element is also very significant there. It said, and echoes of the Weinberger doctrine, it said that we would have a very strong military. We would rebuild our military, our defense industrial base. Reindustrialization is a top theme throughout that document and certainly in the rhetoric. But we would use that military sparingly. And that's similar to what Senator Vance said last night in his very moving and I think compelling acceptance speech. But, just at a more sort of kind of feeling level, I'm sure there's a good German word for it, finger feel level, there's a lot of enthusiasm. There's a lot of optimism. There's a pretty strong degree of unity. Obviously, you've seen a lot of stuff about the selection of Senator Vance. I'm a huge admirer of his and a very big fan of this pick and this ticket. But I think on the whole, you see a lot of consolidation going into the election. I know President Trump and Senator Vance are going to campaign tomorrow together, I believe, in the Upper Midwest. And of course, looking at the other side of the political spectrum. I think we all here in the Milwaukee area we don't see an especially compelling alternative. So it's an exciting time.
Ambassador, you are also at the RNC. Rich just alluded to sort of using the military sparingly and peace through strength as new leitmotifs, perhaps, of a potential second Trump administration. Do you share those impressions? And could you perhaps give the audience a sense of what you make of J.D. Vance as a potential vice president for the future of US foreign policy?
Well, yes. First of all, let me say how happy I am not only to be here in Milwaukee, watching the proceedings as a foreign observer. This is exciting. It's extremely interesting. And I do think, if I may start by offering that observation, I do think that the nomination to the vice presidential position of Senator Vance may actually be the opening shot in leading U.S. policy, and certainly not only U.S. foreign policy, U.S. policies into a new era. Also in terms of, generational change. We have, at this moment, still two candidates who are either beyond or at more or less at the age of 80. Senator Vance is half that age. And let's assume that Donald Trump gets himself elected in November. That could well mean that somebody like J.D. Vance at age 40 could be a potential successor. And with his kind of approach to the role that the U.S. government should play and that America should play in the world, that would really, in my view, in my humble opinion, be an enormous change, a generational change, a Zeitenwende. We call, in Germany, what happened in February of 2022, a Zeitenwende, a change of an era. And that could be really the beginning of a changed era. So having said that, let me offer this observation. I have had an opportunity over the last, last night, yesterday, to talk to a good number of senior Republicans, and I'm not going to mention any names, but some of these names are people who served in very important positions in earlier Republican administrations. Not everybody, and this will not be a surprise to Elbridge, not everybody among the Republican foreign policy establishment is happy with the nomination of J.D. Vance. There are classic kind of sort of George Bush or Ronald Reagan Republicans who are not overly happy with the isolationist overtones which Mr. Vance did not talk about in his acceptance speech yesterday, but which he had, of course, in earlier remarks. So while there is now a sense of, almost divine intervention here in Milwaukee after the failed assassination attempt, everybody now flocks around Donald Trump, and even his former opponents like Nikki Haley, etc., are now being supportive, etc. This is a huge fest, as we would say in German. But with respect to J.D. Vance, I note that not everybody is as happy as everybody is with Donald Trump as the candidate. That would be my opening remark.
Thank you. Fascinating. Is there also a Zeitenwende happening in the US politics? I think something that I might get back to in the discussion. But I'd like to now give the floor to Kasia. Kasia, please feel free to also comment on your perception of what's going on in US domestic politics. Yes. But I would also like to shift attention to last week's NATO summit, which you attended. In your view, did the summit live up to expectations? Did the allies do enough to really affirm their unwavering commitment to Ukraine?
Yeah, so welcome everybody. It's great to connect from Warsaw, from Poland. Indeed, I flew from the States yesterday. I attended the NATO summit. I was also in Louisiana when the assassination attempt happened. So I also have fresh feelings, happy to comment on that. But starting with NATO and with the NATO summit, I have to say, I think it was a mixed bag from a perspective of a country like Poland. As you know, Poland is, in terms of GDP, the highest spender on defense, and we have very strongly committed to this spending for the last decade or so. So, of course, our expectations of the summit are always a bit higher than everybody else's. On the one side, we welcome the fact that there was a clear declaration to provide Ukraine with more aid, 40 billion euros in the next year. But our government and Poland in general was hoping actually that the proposal given by Jens Stoltenberg for a multi-year financial pledge would come into life, and that did not happen. Then, of course, we had the discussion on NATO membership of Ukraine. Again, Poland supports that as the ultimate security guarantee. We had this famous now irreversible path of Ukraine into NATO, but at the same time, there is no clear NATO membership date, and the path forward seems very unclear and will be, of course, very much also influenced by the result of American elections. And last, but definitely not least, it's interesting to note that NATO is taking over from the United States the coordination of purchases of military equipment to Ukraine. That, in a way, is also safeguarding, I think, the process from the final election results of the United States in the United States. But at the same time, we have asked also to do more on Russia, even such things as symbolical suspension of the NATO-Russia Founding Act. These decisions have been moved to Hague. So my general impression was, it was a well-prepared summit, that's for sure. There was no drama of the kind I've seen in Vilnius last year, when there were a lot of expectations and they were simply not met. But at the same time, a lot of things have been pushed forward because, as you say, the site event in the United States may mean a lot of things. And of course, here in Poland and in the Baltic states, we're looking very closely to which direction this is going to head, because our region usually, either benefits or is a victim of these huge changes of geopolitical processes. And I think this is going to be very existential to countries such as Poland. So, of course, we prepare ourselves for different scenarios, but hope for the best, especially as we've benefited immensely for the 30 years where we have been part of the NATO alliance, part of the European Union, part of the Western world that we were deprived from because of the Yalta Agreement in 1945.
Thank you. While we wait for the audience to gather their thoughts, let me ask another series of questions. Bridge, Kasia just summarized the outcomes of the NATO summit, made a case for perhaps even that it should have been stronger in its commitment, but surely one of the things that stood out was the language of irreversibility. Do you agree that Ukraine's path to membership is irreversible? And if I may ask just a second question based on what the ambassador said before, is J.D. Vance's appointment a sign of the shifting power between the different Republican foreign policy tribes, which until now had been fairly unclear where they stand?
Yeah, maybe I'll take your first one or second one first, Leonard, and address some of the points just made. Look, I think I certainly don't want to try to characterize Senator Vance, his position as the vice presidential, nominee. That's a different position than being the senator and so forth. But I think, his own views are abundantly clear. And I mean, for instance, he, I think, gave them very eloquently at the Munich Security Conference earlier this year and in the Financial Times. And I'd commend those remarks to everybody's attention. I think as he put it, a wake-up call that President Trump and he have been giving to the allies. I mean, what I would say is my own view is that many of the points that Senator Vance has been making are a reflection of reality rather than personalities. So, I think the ECFR's, which the Economist has used, representation of the spectrum of Republican debate is the most effective one. The internationalist versus isolationist divide is, I would say, an inaccurate and generally tendentious framing used for political purposes. The more effective and accurate sort of framing is from Primacists. It's essentially about the question of what is the viable and proper American role in the world. And on one extreme, you have Primacists, basically global hegemony. You could put John Bolton and on the more liberal end, Robert Kagan on that side. And then the other extreme would be genuine isolationists, of whom there are very few. Maybe Senator Paul. I don't know if he would take, kind of assume that role, but there's quite a few people there. And then in the middle, I would call it what the ECFR and economists is called prioritizers. The basic argument I would say that the people like me are making in the prioritizer sort of lane, which I think reflects the sort of where the momentum in Republican foreign policy is this a reflection of reality. I mean, a couple of things. You've heard Congressman Waltz, who spoke last night very eloquently about the botched Afghanistan withdrawal, about the atrocious state of our military readiness, the fact that our shipbuilding. I also saw Senator Sullivan, who's kind of probably closer to the traditional kind of neo-Reaganite wing. I think he would endorse that, but also talking about limits in our shipbuilding and defense industrial base capacity. Fiscally, Speaker Johnson gave a very compelling and sort of stimulating speech at Hudson. But I think the most important thing is that he said the primary threat to the American people is the national debt, and he did not call for dramatic increases in defense spending. That is not part of the platform. There could be increases, and certainly I, for one, would be happy about that. I don't speak for the campaign, but it's not a central part of the agenda. I was actually having a little bit of a debate with some German parliamentarians about this just before the MSC reception here. So military, and then of course, the core number one piece of the agenda, the platform, and what Senator Vance said, what President Trump's been talking about, is reindustrialization. The fact that China now has 200 times the shipbuilding capacity of the United States. So, the tribal issues are important, but the way I think about it is, even if primacist people, inclined people, were in power, and I assume there will be people who are influential who have that point, you can't run that playbook. So this is a structural factor, and I think Senator Vance is obviously an incredibly compelling and important pick, but it's more fun. It's structural basically, and that's what he himself has said. So I think obviously there was a Politico article that Jonathan Martin did about many of the complaints. Wolfgang heard some of those as well. I know there's Tucker had a tweet about this as well. So that's an open secret. But I think Senator Vance yesterday he said, like, we're a big tent. We're going to be peace through strength. Those debates are going to happen because they're tough issues. But I think you can see the direction of travel, and I think that gets to the second parts. Just kind of what Eastern Europeans should expect, and Central Europeans and Germans is, we're not going to go back to Robert Kagan's preferred world. I mean, I don't think it was a good policy at the time, but it's totally implausible now. And extending the tax cuts is part of the agenda for the Republicans. Protecting Social Security and Medicare is also part. I personally think it's, people should have retirement entitlements and so forth. So, the notion that we're going to double defense spending, as many people who speak to Munich Security Conference and to Europeans regularly intone, is just not credible. I think it could be part of a reindustrialization agenda. My own recommendation has been and will be, let's reindustrialize and make a more robust defense industrial base part of that. But I think that's the kind of the right way to look at it. And you can see the convention here more as maybe a manifestation of that. And if you're on the floor, as Wolfgang I think has been, or you read, there was a piece by Tim Carney in the Washington Examiner just saying you mentioned George W. Bush administration, Wolfgang. I mean, Senator Vance, that was getting cheers when people are saying we don't want to go back to that. Now, that's not where people want to go back, whatever it was 20, 25 years ago. On Ukraine, I mean, look, I object just empirically, it's not irreversible. I mean, my own personal position is Ukraine should not be in NATO. I don't think that a summit document can bind a future American president. The American people should be able to vote on the issue, and the president of the United States, which I hope will be President Trump, he will be able to make a decision in the time frame that he's president. So, NATO can say what it wants in these summit communiques, but the president's going to be able to make a decision in the future.
Great. Before I put that question to the other panelists, whom I'm sure really want to respond to it, Bridget, I just want to push you a little bit on your characterization of Trump as a prioritizer, because there are some question marks about where he falls on that spectrum that you.
Yes, I didn't characterize President. So talk about Senator Vance. I think
open question and where you'd put him, because if you read, for example, his interview with Bloomberg the other day, he at least cast doubt about whether he would, unambiguously defend Taiwan. So my question is, how confident are you that the second Trump presidency would actually be fully invested in the kind of deterrence of China from attacking Taiwan that you and other Asia prioritizers would like to see?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't presume to characterize President Trump's position. I think, you know, I mean, his themes have been clear. The convention themes, which I think we can infer reflect his priorities, are strength, but peace. He's talked repeatedly about World War III. My own argument is that the best way to achieve peace is from a position of measured strength, especially vis-a-vis China. So for those who are interested, I laid out this idea at greater length in a national conservatism speech. Senator Vance was the keynote speaker. I spoke, I think, the day before, with a combination of strength, focused, given the limits on our military capacity that Senator Vance has been very eloquently pointing to, but then an openness to a modus vivendi. And I think President Trump, and I think this is consistent with his point, that he is open to dialogue with Xi Jinping. He has not used the language of some Republicans who call Xi Jinping Hitler, or say that, you know, we need to dominate, regime change the Chinese Communist Party and so forth. I mean, I personally am anti-communist. I think communism is evil, but like as a matter of state policy, I think that the kind of rhetoric he's using towards China, which is, you know, a sort of openness to a modus vivendi, is the right one. Let me address the issue of Taiwan. First of all, you know, it's a presidential decision, as apropos a la the mixing up my terms, but, you know, relevant to the point on irreversibility. It's ultimately up to the President of the United States. What I've always said is that Taiwan is very important to the United States, but it's not existential. The key thing is for the foreign and defense establishment to give the president the best possible option. President Trump pointed to undeniable realities, which are that Taiwan's very far from us, and it's very close to China. And I think he used the term, it's the apple of Xi Jinping's eye. Check, check, check. And that Taiwan has used industrial policy to help move chip production, high-end chip production, to Taiwan. Those are all facts. I think the job, and when I was in the Pentagon, I was saying, I was never presuming that I could speak for the president or anything like that, but that the point of the defense establishment is to give the president the best possible option, because I think Taiwan is important to the United States, but it's not existential. But if we, you know, the analogy I always use is, you know, if, like Churchill in 1940, if we send the Spitfires and Hurricanes to the collapsing Battle of France, you can't defend the home islands from a German invasion. Well, it's the same idea. If you can't give the president a good option at a reasonable level of cost and risk, and that's ultimately a political assessment, then that's a failure of the security and defense establishment. And the reality is that we haven't been. And of course, now in the Biden administration, there's a lot of political activity in Asia, but there's woefully inadequate focusing of our military resources and financial resources. And Senator Vance pointed to that in his interview with Sean Hannity on Monday, saying we've been distracted in Europe, and this has inhibited our focus on Asia. The second part of this is what I've been saying to the Taiwanese for years. I told this to Ischinger to his face. You cannot assume that President Trump is clearly speaking for a broad swath of the American people. And just point of order, many of the people who I'm sure Wolfgang is talking to privately, because I've heard them, will question whether the American people will actually defend Taiwan, including Joe Biden. I bet. I haven't heard it from him, but there's real. Joe Biden's not acting as if he's like really putting the military forces there to back that up. So I think what I've been saying to the Taiwanese for probably 4 or 5 years now, maybe more, is you should be spending 10%. What are they actually doing? They're spending 2.4% or something to that effect, less even than the South Koreans, which I've been very tough. I'm not necessarily very popular in Taiwan for this reason, but to me, same logic I take with the Poles who are doing exactly what they should be. With Germany, not so much. This is, we've got to be clear with our allies that they need to act in a way where we will help those who help themselves.
Thank you, Ambassador Bridge, and I'm paraphrasing him now. Essentially said that there was a conflict between theaters to some extent, at least, that the US support for Ukraine is distracting from the Indo-Pacific. Now, what is your position on the question of how the two theaters are, or in fact are not, connected?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think Elbridge and I have had a couple of exchanges over recent months about exactly this issue. Well, since you ask, let me offer my view. I think in geostrategic terms, it is not possible to deal with China/Taiwan separately or independently from Russia/Ukraine. Let me put it in more concrete forms. I've heard many Republican strategists over the last couple of days talking, not surprisingly, about China as the one major quote unquote existential potential threat to the United States. Well, okay, if that's the analysis, then I would say if the Trump strategy would be, as has been suggested by President Trump himself and some of his supporters, the strategy, if his strategy would be to bring about a very early end of the Ukraine war, then the question is, of course, on what terms would that conflict be ended? And my concern from a geostrategic point would be if an end to this conflict is produced, which would allow Russia and, seconded by Beijing to say, we denied a victory by NATO / the United States in Ukraine. They accepted a painful compromise, very painful compromise for themselves, and therefore we won. In other words, are we risking, in terms of how we shape our future Ukraine strategy, are we risking to offer on a silver platter a tiny little gift to China? Question mark. That's my strategic question. In other words, I think these things are linked, and this is why I have held that if America is interested in finding the best possible ways to deter China from even thinking about some adventurous military activities in the South China Sea or or on Taiwan, then I think the best U.S. and the best NATO strategy, in addition to U.S. strategy, would be to demonstrate clear-headedness, determination, and full support for Ukraine going forward. I think the Chinese are watching every day, every morning, every afternoon, every evening, how we're doing in Ukraine. If America takes a long time to offer 60 billion additional, a package of support, that's being noted in China, and I would be worried that it's being noted in, and understood in the wrong direction, namely as a sign of undecidedness, of getting tired of all of this. So this is my worry. I think we cannot separate the two issues totally. Finally, I don't want to speak too long, but I would fully agree with Elbridge Colby on one issue. He mentioned the term reindustrialization. I am totally supportive of that, because if you are, and of course I'm not a military historian, but I've listened to military historians, and if you're looking for how the United States and her allies successfully defeated Nazi Germany and Japan in the 1940s, it was not simply some victorious battles in Iwo Jima or in Stalingrad. It was the fact that by 1943-44, the United States alone produced more military equipment, airplanes, ships, tanks, jeeps, etc., ammunition, than all the other participants in this war on both sides combined. And that allowed the victory. That led to the victory. So I think there is a good lesson also for us in Europe. We have been totally negligent. And that would be my final remark. I think we need, going forward, if we have an adult, Zeitenwende kind of American approach to a realist approach to America's needs and desires, then of course we need to adopt an adult approach. The adult approach needs to include one important element, and that is we in Europe have had no choice but to buy 2/3 or even more than 2/3 of our recent military additional equipment from the United States because there was nothing European on the market. And that is just simply not sustainable. We cannot expect governments to survive in Europe if they spend these billions and billions and billions of dollars buying from Lockheed Martin or Raytheon, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, I hope the United States will be smart enough not to criticize Europeans for building up their own capacity in terms of defense production, ammunition production, airplane development and production. This is not to make America less successful, but it is to make Europe a better partner.
Thank you, Ambassador. Some interesting agreements on industrial policy, on perhaps that the Europeans should take a bigger role, but some disagreements also on whether US credibility is actually on the line in Ukraine vis-a-vis China. Now, I have a couple of interrelated questions for Kasia. You have just heard from Bridge that he is not in favor of Ukraine's NATO membership. At the same time, I think Poland is often singled out as one of the strongest allies the US has in Europe. So I wonder, how do you think the Donald Tusk government will be able to navigate these tensions? Because if we go back in history, it was the Polish government, the previous Polish government, that had perhaps had the best relations with the first Trump administration.
Thank you, Leonard. If I can go back first to the question of these two theaters, the European and the Indo-Pacific, and I completely agree with Wolfgang that they are interrelated, and that if China is indeed this existential threat from the United States, these cannot be separated. And I'll give 3 reasons for this. First of all, we agreed last week during the NATO summit that China, and this was in the final declaration, has been the decisive enabler. I will use the words from the declaration, decisive enabler of Russia's war in Ukraine. This has been shown through both financial assistance to Russia, material support to Russia, political support to Russia, allowing Russia to, go around sanctions we have imposed on that country. And of course, we have to ask ourselves why, what is at stake for China that it has decided over the last few months, especially, to very, openly side with Russia in this conflict. And apart from this, and this is very worrying from our perspective, we have seen the first ever exercises of China with Belarusian soldiers on Belarusian soil. So we are seeing the Chinese now close to the NATO border, and that only shows you that China does not make a distinction between these theaters. It does understand that weakening the United States, presence in Europe means also weakening the United States' ability to deliver to allies in Indo-Pacific. And that understanding is very clear. So if the United States cannot defend Europe, how can it defend the Indo-Pacific? That is the thinking in general. So that's point number 1. But I also think that the United States in itself is not at all, as Bridge is saying, isolationist. I have not encountered too many congressmen, or actually even Americans, who really think that the United States should withdraw from the international stage. On the contrary, the public support, for example, to assisting Ukraine still remains relatively strong. We see it in the 60% even. So I truly believe that, most Americans will say we should not leave our allies behind. And Ukraine is often perceived as such an ally, fighting against Russia. And number 3, Europeans and Americans, I truly believe, have real interest here not to allow China to become a dominant player in the international system. I have been one of the people who have, for many, many years, actually advocating for one China policy of the European Union that is more aligned with also American views of what's happening in China. And what's happening today, with the kind of Chinese-Russian alliance around Ukraine, and not only proves that we need to understand fact that China in the long term is not going to be a friend. We've believed that Russia is going to be a friend. We believed we can do business with Russia. We found out the hard way in the last 2 years, including this complete decoupling from energy reliance on Russia. And, my fear is that, if we don't prepare, if we don't de-risk quickly enough, if we don't take the worst case scenarios, we'll find ourselves as Europe in this, interdependence with China pulling the strings. So the United States needs us. We need the United States. We are on the same page in so many different ways. And I truly believe, that the United States has no interest in pulling away from Europe. And most importantly, it have no interest in seeing Ukraine lose. What you said, Bridge, I think, if this is really just going back to the Vandenberg doctrine, which have the United States used this doctrine during the Iraq crisis, as Colin Powell asked the administration to do, the United States would not stretch out between Afghanistan and Iraq. If it is only that the new administration is going to show, so then Ukraine is a very good example where the United States does not have to have its troops, does not have to have its forces on the ground, commits only some military assistance, with Europe, and I want to really stress this to our viewers, spending the second half of military assistance to Ukraine. Today, Europeans are spending half of, the Europeans are committing actually half of all military assistance to Ukraine. It's not only the United States that is doing that, and most importantly, the Europeans have committed over 70% of financial support to Ukraine. So again, we are on the same page here, and I truly believe that, even if Bridge, you believe now that these are two different theaters, I think China will make you believe that they are not.
I'll just say, I think it's important to, I understand both of the other panelists have strong views, and whether those reflect the thinking of the ascendant sort of perspective, at least in the Republican Party, I think is another matter.
Thank you, Kato. We have questions now coming in from the audience, and if the audience forgives me for paraphrasing, but there's one question for Bridge, which neatly links to what we've just been discussing, and that is, if there is a military overlap between the two different theaters, what are really the US capabilities that should be removed from Europe? And then there's a second question, and it touches upon both what the ambassador said, and that is whether you agree that for Europeans to really step up, it also comes with the fact that Europeans will have to spend much more of their defense spending in Europe rather than with US manufacturers, which, truth be told, is not necessarily a favorite line of many Republicans in the past.
Sure. Let me address these in order. Actually, I think probably, honestly, the best source of the issues of trade-offs are some of the memoranda and statements that Senator Vance and his staff have released over the last few months. I think there have been a couple of fact sheets that they've pointed to where, first of all, $200 billion is a lot of money. So there's a lot of money there. And second of all, there are direct trade-offs. Because there's been a notion, although it seems to be declining, that like a defense of Taiwan or another ally along the first island chain like the Philippines would not be a ground fight. And that's just wrong, because of course you have to assume that the Chinese would get ashore. So if you wanted to have a capable deterrent, you would need air defense, obviously, with Patriots, but also short range air defense, ground weapons, et cetera. And then the attention of the defense industrial base and the capacity of the defense industrial base, as Senator Vance has, I think, repeatedly laid out, is scarce, and we're not where we need to be, and it's going to take time to get there, even if we pursue, as I hope we do, the kind of Trump-Vance agenda on this. Things like turbofans, things like TNT, I think Mike Gallagher has talked about. So there's huge amounts of trade-offs, and that's sort of the and again, I think to Wolfgang's point, and also to to Katarzyna's, like there's I get that Europeans are making this argument. You may even believe it, but I think, like, from a point of view of, we're going to have, what Senator Vance said to Sean Hannity the other night, that has to be the way. Common sense, as the platform puts it, peace through strength American policy focused on China, is we have to husband our scarce military power. And of course, the fact that the Chinese and the Russians are working more closely together with the North Koreans and the Iranians only means we need to prioritize more, because we have to assume that they're going to act collaboratively, precisely to stretch us out. And of course, my sort of favorite rebuttal of this argument is the fact that the Chinese are not acting as if the Taiwan issue or their ambitions in Asia are going to be resolved in Ukraine, because if they did, they would directly intervene militarily, or at least provide, abundant lethal aid, which they could do, which they're not doing. Instead, what they're doing is they're kind of bleeding us out. And of course, now you have a situation in which the United States is handing out, even thinking about further commitments, an irreversible commitment to NATO, Ukraine coming into NATO, and the potential for extending a security guarantee to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia after the Biden administration, basically tried to banish the Saudi leadership before that. And yet the defense budget's not going up, and I'm reading today that the Congress is only going to actually appropriate one attack submarine for next year, which of course raises huge questions about the viability of AUKUS. So look, if we lived in a world in which, President Biden talks like JFK, supporting a friend, bearing a burden, but he's kind of spending like Bill Clinton. And I don't get that. And, there are Republicans who would say, well, we should double defense spending, but does anybody see any real evidence of that? I mean, what Senator Wicker, and I think this would be helpful, is talking about is maybe $25 billion extra, but that's about 2 to 3% of the defense budget. So that is kind of my recommendation for how we're going to have to act. I'd also just say, if Ukraine is so important, like, why did the German government just cut Ukraine aid? Why didn't Chancellor Scholz, who obviously feels very willing, he's done so at least twice, very prominently, endorse President Biden, basically, including in his Axel Springer interview around the G7. He's not giving Minister of Defense Pistorius, who, as far as I'm concerned, is a hero. He's not giving Pistorius all the money that he's asking for the Zeitenwende. So, this is the debate I was having with the very, German parliamentarians the other day, who were getting in high dudgeon about how, wow, we have to do what Ronald Reagan did. And I said, sir, with respect, why don't we turn around? Why aren't you spending 4%? Poland, I think you can, across governments of very different complexions, you can say they are. And the Poles are doing the right thing, which is, yes, we're going to hope the Americans come to help. We're going to ask the Americans to come to help, but we're going to, have a strong defense in any case. Even some of the Baltic states aren't doing that. I've told my Estonian friends and Lithuanian friends, this is the way forward. So, I think what we can see, and again, I'm not speaking for the campaign, but what we can see is, I think there's going to be greater skepticism when people are calling us isolationists, and it's like, well, we're spending 3.5 and you guys aren't, I guess the Free Democrats are saying that fiscal issues are serious in the Ukraine context. Oh, okay. I thought that was isolationist. It's like, well, let's all get on the same page. Let's all spend, I understand that there are fiscal issues all around, but so there are here too. And Wolfgang and I have debated this point about historic responsibility. I think we all have historic responsibility to step up.
Thank you. Kasia, I want to...
finger.
I'm going to get your opinion anyway. So if you hold this finger just for a second, and then perhaps answer afterwards. If we follow Bridget's argument to its conclusion, it means that there's a very serious possibility that the US will, in the short term, withdraw at least some of the capabilities and perhaps other military assets from Europe. Now, the obvious risk of that is that there could be a security vacuum in Europe. From a Polish perspective, being located in the eastern flank, what do you make of that?
Well, for us, I will say that, very seriously, it is an existential threat. It is an existential threat because it clearly shows to Vladimir Putin that the United States is withdrawing from Europe. This has been the goal of the Putin regime for the last 2 decades, to make sure that the Americans and Europeans split, and that the Americans actually leave the European continent. The continent has been, and we have to admit this, extremely successful, prosperous, and so on, because we were under a US umbrella. And we said that before many times, that we have to contribute our own share to defense. But we also understand that even if we contribute 5% or 10%, we will not be able to build the type of industrial capabilities that the United States have in the next 5 to 7 years. And this is the perspective we're looking at, for worst case scenarios when we look at Poland. And the moment the Americans start to withdraw from here, just like they withdraw, very quickly from Afghanistan, I'm sorry to make that, but I truly believe that, for Vladimir Putin, that was the sign of weakness of the United States. And he attacked Ukraine, understanding that the United States is, as he says, in a deathbed. So what happens for countries such as Poland? Well, yes, we will, we currently have now, I think, the third largest army in NATO after the United States and Turkey, 200,000 people. But that is far from being enough to withstand pressure from a imperialistic Russia. If there's some ceasefire, if Russia takes over more territory, if it's able to kind of swallow up Ukraine and swallow also the population of Ukraine, of the industrial complex, although that will be very, very difficult, then we have to imagine a scenario in which in a few years Russia is going to test NATO. It will test NATO in Narva, Estonia, it will test NATO in Lithuania. It will start through hybrid attacks, but it will eventually also use hard force, as Russia does. And again, this will be provoked especially strongly if we see clearly that the United States is no longer interested in the European continent. That the big question, of course, is will the Europeans step in? Yes, will they? And I personally believe that, in these kind of worst case scenarios, we will see, as we saw around Ukraine, some kind of a unification. But we are running against time, especially in the question of our European industrial capabilities, defense capabilities. I don't think we are all, serious enough. And here I completely agree with Bridge. We should be doing so much more and so much faster. And this, of course, is because many of European societies do not feel the sense of urgency. So if you ask a Spanish, a Portuguese, a Greek, I do understand that they have a bit of a different perspective and they see threats somewhere else. But this growing threat to Europe from Russia will affect everyone, will affect, of course, the single market and so on and so forth. So I think, in these worst case scenarios, we'll have to come together. My two-finger, issue, however, to Bridges, it's not like China. First, China doesn't really have a history of intervening too much in foreign conflicts. So I can't imagine them, okay, we can discuss, but yeah. But even if they decided to be all hands in Ukraine, that would mean complete decoupling from the European market. And we are at the moment, and I think this was one of the reasons the Chinese have been at the beginning pretty slow in helping Russia, but they speeded up, seeing that they bear little consequences of doing so. It was that because they feared EU sanctions. They really did not want to get into, a trade war with the EU. They have vested interests here and so on. So I think that is a, unrealistic. That was an unrealistic scenario that they would actually physically be in Ukraine. However, can I imagine this to happen one day? Again, I'm seeing Chinese soldiers in my neighboring country, 300 kilometers from Warsaw. So I can imagine a lot of different things happening in the next decade or so. But again, I don't think that could have happened in any scenario 2 years ago, which again doesn't mean that China was not this decisive enabler, continues to be, of this war. And without China, Russia would not be able to continue the war. And it's not bleeding out, it's not bleeding out the United States. It's weakening, surely, our ability to withstand these type of pressures. But it's mostly, first and foremost, extremely hard on Europe. And I think we have to remember about this as well.
Thank you. One point that Kasia just made, Ambassador, I'll give you the floor in just a second. Is the important point that even a really concerted European effort would take some years. And I think from a European perspective, you have to think about how we can extend the timelines so that perhaps the American retrenchment, should it happen, were to be delayed until the point where, through a very ambitious plan, we would have actually put ourselves in a position that we can replace those capabilities that we really rely on. But Ambassador, I know you want to comment on this, and please do, but I also have another question for you. You are a seasoned German diplomat. Perhaps you can put on your German diplomatic hat for a second. If Ukraine is indeed an existential threat, not just to Poland, but to European security, how do you explain to the American listeners and others German budgetary decisions over the past few weeks and years?
Well, I'll be honest, on the last part of your question, I'm really pleased that I'm not somebody who needs to answer these questions. I would not know how to. I think that we are falling short. We're not falling short of the 2% goal this year, which is good, but we're falling short in terms of medium and long-term planning, which is really a pity. But please allow me to make two very brief points. And one of my points is really more a question to Bridge. The question I have is the question of our strategy if it turns out that NATO membership, which at the summit, as Katarzyna pointed out, was deemed irreversible, if Ukrainian membership in NATO does not materialize. Let's be realistic about this. It requires the parliamentary procedures to be completed in 32 member states, and it's as a long-time diplomat, it's very easy for me to visualize how easy it will be to find 1, 2, or 3, or 4 members of the North Atlantic Alliance who will find it either totally impossible or at least not possible in the current situation to put this successfully through their own parliaments. In other words, as desirable as I personally would find Ukrainian membership, it's a pretty high hurdle. My question to Bridge, therefore, is, do you have what is your recipe? I know you are not in favor of Ukraine membership in NATO, but what is your recipe to make sure that 3, 4, 5 years from now, the Russians will not come up with some renewed appetite with reinforced military capabilities and start, another round of aggression, which will provoke enormous cost on our side and conceivably on the US side, if you don't want to lose your European allies, etc. So that's really my question. And in other words, my question is, how can we protect Ukraine even if NATO membership is not going to happen anytime soon?
Yeah, I'll give you a direct answer.
You
may. It's a direct question. Yeah, I'll be brief, but I mean, Wolfgang, I'll go back to the first part. I mean, we can't just wave away the fact that the German government is not doing its part. It's totally unacceptable. And it's not our fault. You need to go, with respect, you need to go to tell your government that this is completely unacceptable. And we are not going to be holding the bag for this. We're giving you plenty of warning. We've been ignored. President Trump was ignored. If it's so serious, this should be unacceptable. People should be resigning from the government. And nobody has more of a responsibility on this, as we've discussed, than Germany. Let's be really honest. Why are we spending 3.5% of our GDP on defense? We don't have universal health care insurance in the United States. Germany could solve this problem if it spent, say, 1.5% more. Oh my gosh, I can't imagine. No. That is the solution. And that's what Senator Vance's been saying. That's what President Trump has been saying. I don't speak for them. But, why should we be handing out further security commitments? And I understand your point, Katarzyna, like, as a Pole, and I'm very sympathetic to Poland. I really admire what you're doing, of course, your history, et cetera, and everything you've been through. But, read the room, as the kids say. Like the American people, the Republican convention is like, the whole point is not to be the global policeman. It's about the forgotten man. That's like the theme of the forgotten men and women. That's the theme of the convention. And yes, strength, but strength that's common sense. And how is it common sense for us to be, and a lot of this is our fault. And let me be really clear. A lot of this is the fault of the United States of America, particularly the very foreign policy establishment that, Wolfgang, I think you're referring to, probably talking to. They're the people that President Trump and Senator Vance have been criticizing. They're in a sense running against that. And that's not isolationism. That's bringing, like a business, bringing democracy, bringing our foreign policy into line with the long-term interests of the American people. So I would say, what I said to the Bundestag members, with respect, I think the answer to this lies with you. And we will be there. My belief is we should be there to help. We should remain in NATO. We should come to the aid of, but this was not the plan for NATO, for the Europeans to be perpetual dependents. This was not what Eisenhower had in mind. I think this was not what Adenauer had, certainly not what Winston Churchill, Charles de Gaulle had in mind. So, we just kind of got to go back to basics.
I have one question, George, because
Kasia, I'll give you the final floor. Okay.
But I wanted to give a question to Rich, so.
Okay, you take it. Go on.
No, I fully agree with you that the priority should be Americans. I have plenty of family and friends in the United States. I know that life in the United States is hard, and it's unfair. People work hard. They don't have the medical coverage. They don't have so many things that they deserve, and I fully understand you. But I think for the viewers and for myself, I would really, you said, Taiwan is not existential for the United States. If you could tell us, who is existential? What is existential for the United States in foreign policy? I think that would help us also to understand where we are.
Existential. The United States is existential. I wrote a whole book about how our, and I've worked in the Trump administration on defense strategy, that our alliances are important. But as I've said, I don't think President Biden is right to call alliances sacred. The whole point of America is that politics is not sacred. So they're very, very important interests. But the core interest of the United States, in my view, abroad, is to prevent a hostile power from agglomerating so much power that it could undermine the American way of life. It's not the rules-based international order, whatever that is. People cooked that up like 25 years ago. During the Cold War, our strategy was containment. And as you point out, and Yalta is part of the story, but of course, Poland was also occupied by Germany and destroyed as an independent state. So there's a long history. The United States repeatedly decided we were not going to fight a large-scale nuclear war with the Soviet Union. In 1956, President Eisenhower did not intervene in Budapest or in Hungary. 1968, Czechoslovakia. In the early 80s, with Solidarity in Poland, the United States did not intervene militarily. We always, Reagan. People always point back to Reagan. I think where the party is now is closer to how Reagan actually governed, because Reagan's rhetoric tended toward the high flying. But if you look, the Weinberger doctrine is really about, particularly post-Vietnam. Reagan did not use the military much. Partially because of the political constraints after Vietnam. But I think, that the whole point is to make it make sense for the American people. That's what Poland's doing. So I applaud Poland, including governments of different ideological complexions. But I would recommend you talk to your neighbors about their responsibilities.
We are talking.
I'm sure
Kasia
will. I am afraid we are reaching the end of our discussion, as fascinating as it's been. I think this could go on for much longer. I think the debate's shown that we are in an incredibly consequential period for the transatlantic relationship. And I think it underlines that we need to keep having those discussions in which we agree on some things, we disagree on others, but that exchange actually leads us to better understanding, teasing out some of the nuances. So all that is left to say is to thank you, panelists, for taking the time. Thank you for the audience. Take care and bye-bye.
Thank you.